new Dan times. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'll mention it to my bosses.
all right. Let's see, it's being recorded now. I gotta put my A game on.
Yeah, now I'll be
Um,
serious. Okay.
yeah, so I mean, something we kind of touched on briefly earlier was your time international and overseas between London and Hong Kong. Do you want to tell us, what you were doing there, kind of what day to day looked like for you there, time difference?
So I was with the Express Desk, doing the general assignment thing so it was 2 years in Hong Kong and 2.5 years in London. I was sent overseas basically because there was a lot of news that was happening in the world while New York was asleep, and the skeleton staff overseas couldn't get to all of it. And so I was kind of supporting that, but also looking for these kind of fun stories while, over there as well. A lot of times we would recognize them in New York, but everybody that we would want to talk to was asleep, and so we couldn't really do much with it. So it enabled me to jump on some stories faster. My favorite example of that would be Grumpy Cat died the announcement went out at 6 a.m. Eastern time. And so that's the kind of thing that in the past, A, the Times wouldn't have touched that story, obviously, but two, or B, me being able to see that and then immediately switch into like, I'm going to write an obit of Grumpy Cat mode. Because I didn't have that many editors to tell me no. I just kind of did it. And, I had one or two editors in Asia who supported me on that. And I just had to like cancel happy hour. This was 6 p.m., which my friends were like, yeah, it's very on brand for you to cancel a happy hour because you have to write an obit for Grumpy Cat.
Hmm,
But yeah, so being overseas where you have both the time zone advantage, but also a lot of these stories that that are only exist over there. It was great. And then I was there in Hong Kong during the big protest movement in 2019. And so while some days were about Grumpy Cat obits, a lot of days were about the protests. And so I was, donning the gas mask and the helmet and going out in the streets with the protesters and really getting to know them a lot, and writing a lot of features off of it, which was really fun. And yeah, it was an incredible experience. I'm so grateful for that. And then London was kind of more of the same, except fewer tear gassy protests, I guess. The Queen died, so something goes wrong wherever I go, I guess. But yeah, no, it was an amazing experience, and being able to both kind of separate yourself from what's going on in America was good for my soul, I think. But also as a journalist, getting to understand the rest of the world, I think it's given me some good perspective that I've taken back.
awesome. And what did, kind of your social life look like? Like I know a lot of people are interested in international reporting and that's something they dream about. Like, what are some of the really good things and what are some of the kind of things that they should be prepared for? What is it like communicating with family? Who comes with you? Who stays behind?
Right. So, depending on where you go, I mean, most places that would hire journalists that, journalists would get sent to, there's probably going to be a fairly significant expat community. So I actually found it really, really easy to make friends because you have a lot of the English speakers who would hang out with each other. And yeah, I honestly found it not too difficult. There was even a Penn State student who was originally from Hong Kong, and we got in touch and we got dinner one day just because, any kind of connection you have, it's, you kind of lean on that. So yeah, socially, I actually found it great. I maybe was probably my favorite part of the experience, honestly, and all the travel you get to do from there. The family part is hard if you're awake when they're asleep and vice versa. You can't really watch Penn State football because it's on at 1 a.m. But you make sacrifices.
Awesome. Give me a second here. Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. I mean, kind of building off of that and like home, you're originally from Bowlesburg, kind of been
Mhm.
all over the world. What are kind of some of the things that you took with you on these travels? Perspective is very, like, what different perspectives did you have compared to, a coworker who grew up in Manhattan and, only knew the city as compared to, coming from central PA?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think about that a lot because, a lot of my friends did grow up on the Upper East Side, and, when they were 21, they moved to Chelsea, and, that's kind of the extent of their moving around. I feel like it gave me good perspective on how the world works outside New York. And I do think that sometimes it can be very insular when you're in New York, which is why I never liked New York growing up. I always thought, oh, they're so arrogant there. Ah, God, they just think that nothing exists outside New York. And I now see that, yeah, that's exactly what they think. It is remarkable. But yeah, I think that it did give me good perspective, on some of my friends here say, you're friends with Republicans? How's that possible, right? And say, no, that's yeah, quite a few. That's normal. And it's the kind of thing where I do feel like when you are covering the entire country, it's important to experience I hate to say a diversity of people, but it is, it's geographical diversity, in really every sense of the word. So yeah, I appreciate that I kind of got the taste of both. Now that I've been ruined by the city for 11 years. Yeah, I'm proud of being from State College. So there's a townie on the call, right?
Yes.
There's a townie.
Yeah.
Nice. All right, good.
Awesome. Kind of backtracking a little bit. Um, I was wondering what tips you had for students trying to get into international reporting. What should they, what should they be thinking about? What skills should they really be practicing now, before getting that opportunity? And yeah.
Yeah, I think I mean, number one, you're very lucky at Penn State that has the international program that it does. That didn't exist when I was in school, and I'm extremely jealous. It's such a great opportunity, and I would definitely make use of that if you can. I think otherwise, there's no particular secret sauce to international reporting. I think it's just great reporting that happens to be done elsewhere. So I think, developing your base skills, no matter where that is. I do think that there's, potentially a possibility if say you have, family in another country, excuse me, that you may be able to live with and work from. A lot of times visa issues are a big impediment when you're getting started. So it's not as simple as, oh, there's, stuff going on in Hong Kong. I'm going to go there and I'm going to report from it. You can't necessarily just show up to a place and do that. And so, yeah, certainly if you have any kind of connection, that is a big help. Otherwise, I think, the yeah, I think just developing your base level skills. I find that the most established foreign correspondents that we have are essentially doing a very similar thing to what I was doing on Express, where they're writing, about the presidential election one day, but also have to be able to turn around and write a really kind of fun, look at this thing from Italy that you didn't know existed, right? One of my favorite stories that our reporter in Rome did was Domino's Pizza made a big effort to expand into Italy. And so they opened up dozens and dozens of restaurants in Italy. And the Italian people tried it and said, this is garbage. Why would we ever eat this, right? And so shockingly, it shut down within 2 years. And so, this person who has covered coups and has covered, assassinations and really serious stuff wrote this really, really great story about Domino's Pizza failing in Italy. So I think showing that you have the ability to cover a wide range of things is definitely a skill that they need.
Nice. Kind of building on that and like recognizing your coworkers and seeing the great things that they do. Who's been someone that you've worked with that has really inspired you? And what about them kind of just pushed you to be better?
I mean, it's an incredible privilege at the times. I'm having a hard time narrowing it down, honestly. I think, people have so many different skills. There are the investigative reporters, Suzanne Craig, who got our Trump's tax returns and how she made the most of that story. We have brilliant visual investigations team. There's one person, Malaki Brown, who does just unbelievable, investigations that can only happen through really intense analysis of photos and videos. And it's a very specific skill that a lot of other people don't have. One story that hangs with me was about a homeless woman in New York, or a homeless child in New York. And our reporter, Andrea Elliott, followed her for, I think, like 6, 8, 10 years. It's an unbelievable amount of time to be able to get these really, really deep stories. And then we have some writers who, yeah, I think of Matt Flagenheimer and Andy Newman, who are just incredibly witty with their words. So it's a really wide range of skills that I appreciate. There's so many different things that you can farm out to the Times. It's wild. Yeah.
Awesome. I have a few more questions. So people in the audience, if you want to start thinking of some questions for Dan, that'd be great. But kind of moving on to my next question, what's the project you've been most proud of, or time spent that you have been most proud of?
I think, yeah, breaking the Wordle story was fun. I guess that's probably the one that there was one story that I did that was just one word. And that was pretty exciting. It's the shortest story in the history of the New York Times. The headline was, "When I mistakenly added to an email chain, should I hit reply all asking to be removed?" And the entire article was just the word "no." And it was the kind of thing you don't expect to see in the Times again. And it created like a meme for like a hot minute. It was so that was fun. But in terms of more significant stuff, there's probably something. I think it's developing the voice of the Times on Twitter. I think, I'm not the only person who did that, to be very clear, but it was such an interesting task in that this was something that essentially didn't exist and was kind of a vexing question, like we were talking about earlier. And so I think I'm proud that I have been at the start of these kind of initiatives, also with the Express Desk, and to some extent what I'm doing now with Live, where you come into something new and come into it with creativity and come into it with still kind of an understanding of how the institution works and how good journalism works, and not just kind of blowing everything up, but saying like, how can we do good journalism through this new thing? I think that's, I've been able to do that several times, and I'm happy about that.
Awesome. My last question, at least right now that I have written down, is, it's a question we don't really ask ourselves so much just because we're so busy day to day, but why did you get into journalism?
So I got into it for the same reason that anyone ever does anything, which is that I was trying to impress a girl. I was in high school, and I took an introductory journalism 1 class. I wasn't really that into it. But at the end of the semester, the girl said, "Oh, so you're going to take journalism 2 next year, right?" I said, "Of course I'm going to take journalism 2 next year. Yeah, obviously. Love newspapers, lifeblood of democracy. Let's go." So originally it was to impress her. But then I slowly got into it. And there was a thing at the State College area high school newspaper where we wrote a issue. It was kind of with the theme of sex. We wrote a couple really well-reported stories about condom distribution in schools and about STDs and about like really serious, like actual meaty issues. But our principal decided that that it was not appropriate for a school audience. And so he decided to censor it. And so I did all this research, and I said, so actually, according to Hazelwood versus Kohlmeyer, the 1984 Supreme Court decision, you can't do that. And actually, Pennsylvania has this other law. And so I got really, really far down that rabbit hole, and even went to the Harrisburg State Capitol and testified about, student press laws. And so it just kind of really lit a fire under me, and really appreciating what the press does. And so, yeah, I think that started it. And then I enjoyed everything at Penn State, and just kind of, I never shook it.
Awesome. Does she get any royalties on your work now? She's
So I don't want to brag or anything, but we did date for a week. But then she dumped me for my best friends. But we are still friends to this day. So it all worked out in the end. It's fine. It's fine.
All right. All right. Well, yeah, I'm gonna open it now to the audience. So it looks like Luke has his hand up.
Hey Dan, my name's Luke Vargas. I'm the business manager here at the Collegian. We are working so hard with our socials as we have for probably the last 2 decades, or I guess maybe a little less than that. The phrases I'm hearing now, it's a lot about somehow balancing between not chasing your audience, but somehow really getting great with your different mediums and still providing great journalism. Can you talk about that balance of, I mean, you spoke about it a little earlier about not just following the numbers all the time, but can you talk about finding the right mediums for these stories and how to present yourself really well, especially from our point of view?
Yeah, because I imagine, and nice to meet you, I'm sure you probably had that thought at times where it's just like, if I could just, be in my own voice, I know what would make, so many more views on this video, right? But it doesn't quite fit what the Collegian is, right? Like, I think a lot of us have that thought at times. When Penn State scores a touchdown, that the tweet that's going to take off is, holy shit, unbelievable fucking touchdown, right? And that would get a trillion retweets. But that's not what the Collegian is, right? And so I think that there is, it's hard. It's hard to figure out that balance. But what I do think is that what we shouldn't be held back by is just like, we haven't done it this way in the past. I think, especially now with as fast as things are changing, like, honestly, if we had this thing a year ago, I would have been talking a lot more about Twitter, and I'm barely talking about it now, well, except for my history part, because I don't think that, like, that's barely worth your investment at this point, especially in terms of traffic generation. And so, yeah, I mean, you're seeing how fast things are changing. And so I think this is definitely absolutely no time to be held back by tradition. Obviously, I think that, some tradition is formed for a good reason, and there's a reason you don't say, holy shit, they scored a fucking touchdown. And like, I get that. But I do think that, like, you need to be thinking about that in terms of, why does that not fit the Collegian right now, as opposed to why does that not fit what the Collegian has always done, right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Nick, I have another question, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
You talked about your time abroad, and I very recently had a chance to do a little bit of reporting, and got to meet some international media, or just other reporters, and the standard of ethics, or just the standard in general about what reporters and how they behave or what they do, is entirely different across the globe, especially in countries where, the standard of media is so different, especially with a lot of state-sponsored media and stuff like that. Can you talk a little bit about maybe that ethical side of your journalism throughout your journey, or maybe specifically on the international side?
Yeah, so there was this day in Hong Kong where, and not to go too deep into the Hong Kong story, but the Chinese state media wanted to present, the Hong Kong protesters as in league with the Americans. They wanted to say that they're all CIA plants, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Chinese media had this image that they splashed on a lot of the front pages of a CIA operative who was coordinating with the protesters. And so they have the photo, and they even show his phone, and this is proof that they're coordinating. It says, look, the protesters are going to X spot on Wan Chai Road, right? And so this is presented as proof. The only problem was that this guy that they're photographing was the IT dude at the New York Times. And he was literally texting our reporter, and you could see the reporter's name on it. If they would have Googled it for a second, they would have seen that, this guy is just a New York Times reporter, and this other guy is a anonymous IT guy. And so, yeah, the fact that something like that can be splashed on the front pages was remarkable, right? And so it did in some ways really, really make you appreciate journalistic rigor. And, not to say that we don't have our own issues in American media, we certainly do. But there is something really great about the way we approach verification, the way that we approach, like, we need two sources on this, we need them on the record, I think it did make me appreciate our style of journalism quite a bit. And again, that's not to say that America is the only place that happens. And I think that there are plenty of places that you can do journalism internationally extremely well. But I think, yeah, it does make you appreciate where good journalism does and does not happen.
Oh, that was a brilliant answer. And I got to take a peek at some of your international work and all your, so I'm a big soccer head, and I love the story about Bristol. That was great. So I'm obviously the business manager. I'm no longer with the editorial side. And I know we have some business people in the call tonight. And so I just wanted to ask you a little bit. I had a professor tell me very recently that she felt like almost all news is going to end up being nonprofit very soon, that's really going to be the future. I want to ask you, just what do you see in this landscape right now? I think all of us going into the field want to know, how we're going to get paid? Is our newsroom going to just shrink and collapse on us as soon as we join? What do you see?
So first of all, if I had the actual answer to that, I'd be very, very rich. So I don't, think that I've got it figured out for sure. I think there's something I agree to a significant extent with your professor. I do think that the nonprofit model is one of the promising things that's happening. I think, it isn't quite a fix all, like nonprofits have their own issues and they have their own pressures. And sometimes you replace one set of pressures with another one. The guy who did quite a bit of funding in ProPublica was Sam Bankman-Fried. And, all of a sudden, when that gets wiped away, all of a sudden, boom, pretty big spigot gets turned off. And so, and obviously ProPublica is fine, but that's just, as one example, you do have to worry about, specific individuals. And, another way that seems promising is if a very, very rich person likes journalism. So you look at Jeff Bezos, right now, he's very, very happy to invest in journalism, and the world is better off for it. And thank God, the Washington Post it has its own issues, but it's generally doing pretty well. And so I think in terms of you guys getting hired, in terms of continuing to, have a job in journalism, it feels again like a little bit of a moment where we're just trying a lot. I'm a big Philadelphia sports fan, and just yesterday, they announced this new All City network. So basically, they hired all the best beat reporters in Philadelphia. And it's very similar to what happened with The Athletic like 4 or 5 years ago, where they hire all these great beat reporters and like, boom, we're going to cover local news and we're going to do it great. But their thing is entirely podcasting, not entirely, but largely podcasting / YouTube. So they're doing 5 live shows a day and then turning them into podcasts. I think it's 4 podcasts a day. But one on Eagles, Sixers, Phillies, Flyers every single day. And so they're going deep, deep, deep on this kind of thing. And a lot of these people who were hired, I know there's one woman in particular who I think came up through a broadcast background, but most of them are print dudes who kind of learned how to be comfortable in front of a microphone. And so I think I'll give you a short-term and a long-term answer. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here, but I think short-term, in terms of you guys getting hired, like you guys getting paid out of school, I think the thing that you can really, really sell is understanding the media landscape right now in a way that like my old ass doesn't, right? You have these people in the 30s and 40s coming up with these strategies. But I think that you guys really do have more of a natural sense of not just what 20 somethings, how they want to consume it, but also just how the media landscape works because you guys are living it. And so I think that's a really, really powerful thing that you do have to sell. And I think as you guys experiment more, you're going to have success stories and you're going to be able to look, yeah, we normally got, 5,000 views, 10,000 views, but look at this one that I did that got 1 million views. Here's what I learned from that. Boom, right? You have a story to tell them. And then in terms of long-term stuff, I think it's just adaptability, right? Me being, when I came out of school, it was almost entirely print. And then I was really early on in Twitter. So like me being a Twitter early adopter made me like the young hot shit for a minute, right? But that was a dozen years ago. And if I were still trying to live off of, being good at Twitter, I would be unemployed, right? So you kind of constantly have to be moving to new things. And it's not about, completely throwing out the skill set that you had before. It's about having that foundation, that base of great journalism or whatever your individual skill is and being able to apply that to the next thing. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Dan. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great answer.
We have a question in the chat. We'll start with that, and then Olivia, we'll get to you after. Barb said, if Twitter is not the platform now that it used to be, what should the Collegian be using to promote its stories?
So yeah, I think that it's not that you necessarily need to give up on Twitter, but I don't have access to your numbers, but I imagine you've seen the same thing that we've seen at the Times, which is that it never drove that much traffic to begin with and is maybe dropping even less now than it was in the past. And so I think it is important. To me, it's less about like, I want 100,000 people to click through to this individual story. that can be nice and that can be helpful, but that's not necessarily the thing that's going to sustain you. I think the thing that's going to sustain you is, okay, Penn State just beat Iowa. I am immediately going to go to the Collegian and see what people are writing, right? Or go to their TikTok and see what the like immediate response is, right? And so I think it's the brand placement, like you being that little bug in their brain where people think I need information, I associate that with the Collegian, right? Or like, God forbid, hopefully you never have to worry about a shooting on campus. But if there were, where are people going to immediately go? Like, I need information now. I need like reliable information. I am going to go immediately to the Collegian, right? And so to me, I think the work on social is less about the short term kind of like sugar high of getting a lot of traffic, and more about the like developing that authority, developing the relationship with readers. Even with the New York Times, we've talked a lot about we were really late on TikTok because we knew it wouldn't generate traffic. And the reason that we eventually did come around to it is because we realized that, you don't want to seed an entire generation of people who just don't really think about you that much. And so to me, I think it's a great opportunity in the short-term video, especially, but also kind of whatever comes next, wherever people are, that's where you should be. If for a hot minute Be Real was the hot thing, then that's where we are, right? In the next minute, it's, next year it's going to be something new and we'll be talking about that. But again, it's about kind of adapting your core thing, which is journalism and authority, and figuring out how to put that in the new spot.
Awesome. Olivia?
Hi, Dan. I'm Olivia. I edit our opinions in social media. And when you were talking about kind of the grumpy cat obituary situation, it sparked an idea in my brain. I was just kind of curious how you develop confidence in executing these timely, creative ideas, especially like putting yourself out there when you're unsure if the audiences are going to perceive it in different ways.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I will say that. No, actually, no, that's only 40% true. Maybe 60% true. It's lightly terrifying. But I think that it is a muscle that you build, right? I think, any of us who have tried to be funny in writing understand that it's a very difficult target, right? I think there are things that you'll do that maybe just won't land that well. But it's a learning process. I think I think a willingness to take risks will serve you well no matter what. And a fear of taking risks will not serve you well no matter what, as just kind of a general concept. And so I also think that like a willingness to kind of eat it when it maybe doesn't quite hit the target, but you also learn something from that is also important. The wins feel great, when you do have one that works well. It's a great signal and you can take that with you. So I think I would just, say fuck it, give it a go.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Question from Barb, then we'll get to the three of you. With a quarter of the students turning over every year, how does the Collegian establish itself as the place to go for news?
It's a great question because we have people in the AIG in this call who have been working on the Collegian's credibility for decades, right? I think it is a benefit and a huge advantage that you have in that you have this institution with a lot of, and this is a little buzzwordier than I ever like to be, but brand equity that you've built over a very, very long time, right? I think that, yes, the day-to-day / year-to-year execution may be different. But I think in the same way that the New York Times is not the same as it was 10 years ago or even a year ago, there is something to the idea that, the Collegian has this tryout process and the Collegian generally hires the best writers, and the Collegian takes a lot of care in what they do. And, when the Collegian makes a mistake, they correct it. And, there's just kind of all these things that, I as a journalist understand, like that's what when I hear the word Collegian, I think of, rigor, right? I can think of the process that you guys have. Maybe your average Penn State student doesn't, but maybe that's part of why, you have to develop that relationship with them. Maybe it isn't the like the rigor thing that I'm talking about, maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's also voice. Maybe it's also connection. Maybe it's you know, the great podcast that one person does, or that goofy reel that she saw, right? It could be any of those things, but I do think that like the longer that you do it and the more direct connections that you have with people, it just kind of builds upon itself.
Okay. Ella, Amy, and Joka.
Hi, yeah, I'm Ella. I'm one of the news editors at the Collegian. This is Amy. Um, I was just curious. You mentioned earlier in the meeting how, like, when you used to be posting to the Times website or just tweeting out anything, you'd be nervous because you'd be like tweeting out to like millions of people. Um, I'm just, I don't know. I feel like something that I've run into, like with editing, this is my first semester, is kind of like remaining confident in kind of my decisions and also standing by like kind of my edits. So I'm sure you run into reporters questioning authority, or just really just audience members and readers kind of being like, why did you choose to go this way? Do you have any suggestions on kind of remaining confident in your abilities and kind of just like standing by your decision, even like with potential backlash?
Yeah, so I had a fun thing when I interviewed at the New York Times, and I've never been more terrified in my entire life. And the highest ranking editor that I had to talk to, he was our number 2 at the time. He was terrifying. Well, I thought he was going to be terrifying, but he ended up being this like really, really friendly guy. And he told me that everybody who gets hired at the New York Times is completely convinced that they pulled one over on everybody that they interviewed with. And the only reason that the Times is any good whatsoever is because everybody's constantly terrified of being discovered for the fraud that they actually are. And so everybody works their ass off so that nobody will ever figure it out. And so it was incredibly relieving, and I was so much more relaxed after that, because I realized that we're all walking around with this giant weight of imposter syndrome, right? And if it's not imposter syndrome, it's, you know, the like just the newness of, you know, you're a new editor. Of course, you know, you're gonna question yourself sometimes. And sometimes you're going to be wrong too. I hate to break it to you, but sometimes you might be wrong, right? And that's okay. And that's okay. I think the key part is just understanding that that's okay when you are wrong. But I think it's about kind of developing a process that you're comfortable with, so that you can say, okay, so I really thought this through. And you talk over with the reporter, here's the reasoning for this, blah, 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 blah. And yes, they might, you know, I disagree with my editors all the time, but as long as there is a process behind it and people understand how you got to that decision, I think you can be comfortable in yourself. And yeah, and that also gives you freedom to then question it down the road, or maybe talk to somebody else and say, yeah, maybe I actually do think you were wrong there. But you know, you're not wrong because you're a dum-dum. You're wrong because people get things wrong all the time. And so I would be kind to yourself more than anything, but also just kind of open to questioning. Yeah.
Thank
Hopefully,
you.
I'm not
That's
too
super
mean.
helpful.
What's that?
So hopefully, I'm not too mean.
Uh,
But
It's helpful, so thank you so much.
okay. Does anybody else have any questions? We have 10 minutes left. Luke, anybody else that hasn't asked a question yet?
Oh yeah, I don't know if anyone else has one. I think I'll let it rip. Dan, I'm kind of known for having I don't know, more of a retrospective or introspective approach to a lot of these things. I just have to ask you, you spoke about starting off in that place of having those insecurities, and I'm sure that's true every time you start a new position or a higher position or somewhere bigger. Yeah, I just want to talk to you about your growth as an individual, as a person, throughout your time with the New York Times. Because I'm sure it gives you so much pride to be a part of an organization with such a legacy and such a history, but then also you deal with those insecurities, and the mix of those two things can often do certain things to people. How did you react to those things, and how have you grown?
Yeah, so I think, you know, when I was early in my career, I did 4 years at the Patriot News, and I felt like I was talented, but I didn't think that I was like top of class or anything, right? I thought that I had, you know, enough skills to stay employed, but I certainly, you know, didn't think too highly of myself. And then, you know, as I kind of moved up in the world, and I caught some lucky breaks, and I wouldn't shy from that at all. I also, you know, started feeling more and more like, oh my God, there are so many people who deserve these positions. What am I doing here? And I did have some stumbles for sure. And then when I got to the Times, yeah, the imposter syndrome was crippling for a while. The thing that I usually say is that, like, as far as imposter syndrome goes, or self-doubt in whatever form it is, right? I think it's kind of okay to drive yourself insane, and that may happen. But once you drive yourself insane to the extent that it starts affecting your work, that's when it becomes a problem, right? So if it's just like you going home and just kind of like tearing your hair out, that's one thing. But when you're reluctant to speak up in meetings, or you're reluctant to pitch that story, or maybe if I tried this kind of language, it would be good, but I don't want to take any chances. I'm going to hold myself back. So that's when it becomes a problem, in my view, right? I think a willingness to be bad at things, a willingness to take it on the chin every now and then is a really, really important skill for your development. So with this new job that I'm doing, I think I mentioned earlier that I've never edited before, and I'm slowly figuring that out. And I actually really enjoy the challenge of being bad at something. Because I've only done it a handful of times, and I accept that at the very beginning, I'm going to be here, and I have confidence that I will get here, right? And it's going to take a little while. And I think now on my journey, I'm probably around here. But I recognize that there are times when I will read through a story and I'll say, all right, here are all the edits. And then the second editor comes in and says, oh, you missed this question, this question, this question, this question. I say, yep, should have had that, right? But there are also times that I give myself grace and I say, wow, I caught that. Like that mistake almost went in, and I caught that, and like I'm growing here, right? And so giving yourself a little tap when you do succeed, I think is just as important as being mad at yourself when you do mess up. And so I think the key is just like accept that you are on a growth track, and we are all on a growth track. Like I'm pushing 40 and I'm on a growth track. We're all on a growth track. And that's okay, and that's good, and that's kind of the point of student media and also being young in your career, is to get better at these things.
Question from me. We try and do our best to mimic the professional experience as best as we can with the knowledge that we do have. What are some ways that, like, what was one of the biggest professional culture shocks that you kind of encountered out of college and the CDT?
That's a good question. I know I grew up, both my parents were music teachers at State High, actually. And I was really shocked when I got my first job out of college and realized I had 3 vacation weeks a year. I thought that growing up, all adults got like 3 months off every summer. And so figuring out that, like, oh my God, this is inhumane. That was rough. Other than that, I think the less sexy stuff of working at a big place is just kind of figuring out the internal politics. And I guess to some extent, you probably have a little bit of a training on that on the Collegian, right? Of, if you want this article to happen, like, you gotta be real nice to Nick, right? Like, don't get on Nick's bad side or you're in trouble, right? We all kind of figure out how to work our way around institutions. And so that is definitely a challenge in terms of, how you communicate with your bosses, how you communicate with your colleagues, how you communicate with people who were, in a couple of years, you'll have people who are newer than you. And, are you nice to the interns, or do you try to lift them up, or do you say like, oh no, you can do some of my work, right? That all these little questions don't necessarily have anything to do with, a inverted pyramid style of writing a news story, and all the kind of like basic stuff that we learn in journalism school. But I think the interpersonal part, which also correlates with us figuring out what our whole deal is when we're 21, 22, and like figuring out how to be a person in general. It all kind of goes together on that. So the cultural stuff is a challenge.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question. So if somebody would like, someone we haven't heard from, if possible.
Hello, I have a
Hello.
question. I'm also from State College, so it's really fun to hear you talk about State High and all that. I had a question. You mentioned this idea of like you like to be challenged, right? in our young professional careers, like when is it time to move on? Because I feel like so differently than when a lot of like maybe the past generations, like even past, like the idea was like you're in a job for a longer time. Now it's like you're in a job for a few years and then you move on. Feel like obviously you want to challenge always, but I just didn't know if you had any advice on this idea of like when is it time to transition? Are you always thinking about transitioning? Are you always thinking about leveling up and thinking about what's going to be best for you, but also you have teamwork and you also have a like collaboration and you want to stay at some place to build it up too. So I just, it's a little bit of a rambly question, but just kind of like what do you have any insight on when you're beginning your career like that and you definitely do want to keep going, but also you don't want to, you know, be bulldozing through everything and not actually get the lessons that you should learn at every place that you're at?
Yeah. No, that's a really important question and something that comes up a lot, especially in these days when media jobs tend to be a little bit less stable, right? And so I think, you know, the school thought for a long time was, you know, you don't want to jump around too much because it suggests that you kind of like can't stay in one place. I think that that is less true than it used to be, but not necessarily like thrown out the window entirely. I went through a period once where I left the Patriot News, I went to a startup, and I was so excited about it. Then we all got laid off 9 months later. And then I went to Philly.com and worked for the website of the Inquirer. And I was so excited about this project. And then we got all our funding pulled 6 months later, and I left a month after that. And then I went to ProPublica, and I'm so excited. And yeah, 6 months later, I'm out. So, but then that was to get the job at the New York Times. And so at the time, there was a lot of talk about like, are you hopping around too much? You need to be able to show that you can settle down. But the thing that I always came back to is that each of those moves was made for a reason. First one is because I was laid off, so didn't have a choice about that. The second one was because there was this, you know, it wasn't what I expected it to be. You know, the project didn't exist anymore. So it made sense for anybody to see like, okay, so you had a reason to leave. The third one just wasn't a fit. Plus, I got this job at the Times that I realized would be a wonderful experience. And so that was a very easy thing to, so I did have 4 jobs within 2 years, but each one of them made sense. So I think the bigger issue comes when people leave a job because my manager just was kind of weird. You know, like if you don't really have a great reason to move on, then I think that future employers may say, well, you're going to do the same thing here. Like, you don't like the way we stock the vending machine, and so you leave. Like, I need to invest in somebody who may stick around, right? So if you develop that reputation as somebody who is leaving for kind of no good reason, then maybe that might be an issue. But you know, let's say you have 3 jobs within 2 years, and you're applying to a new one, and you say, well, the reason I left that first one is because they assured me that I would be able to develop this skill, and then it turned out they put me in a role where I never actually had the ability to learn how to do that. And so I felt like I needed to go somewhere else to be able to move on to this next point in my career. And you say to the next person, okay, well, you know, the next place I went, you know, we lost half of our staff and I was doing the job of 3 people. And, you know, being able to present a narrative for why you're moving around, I think is more important than the quantity of places that you go. And so I think, especially when you're early in your career, you prioritize your own development and you prioritize having great bosses, great editors who care about you and want to see you get better. More than anything else, I think like you know, take whatever wonderful jobs you can get, but I do think that I always like to prioritize my growth over a name on a business card. So if it were between, you know, fetching coffee at the New York Times and never getting to write anything versus going to the Patriot News and immediately getting to cover the Hershey area and like building up some great clips, like that's a no-brainer to me. I would do Hershey. But you know, not to say that there are going to be so many different paths that might make sense for you. So I don't mean to like prescriptively say one is better than the other. But I do think that like prioritizing your development is going to be an important thing, even if that means moving around a bit.
Awesome. This has been great, Dan. Any final remarks before we head off for the night?
I guess I would just really hit the point even harder that don't be afraid to screw up and don't be afraid to take chances and don't be afraid to have voice and be creative and try new things. And I say this partly for, you know, the health of the Collegian and making sure that everybody loves the Collegian, but also you guys want to get hired too. And, you know, there are going to be a lot of journalism students who can do the basics, and you want to be able to stand out. And so I think creativity is something that every professional organization needs, and is really demanding right now. And so, yeah, do some cool shit.
Awesome. Dan, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Looking forward to following your coverage in the Times. Insight is much appreciated, and enjoy the rest of your night, Dan.
Thank you, and I appreciate you all. And get in touch anytime you want. I'm pretty easy to find.
Yes.
Thank you,
Dan
Dan.
has a LinkedIn. I'm a big LinkedIn guy.